Welcome to the Farm Science Review after a break of a year. I'm sorry about the weather, there's not much I can do about that. Today, this is the kickoff session in the Ask the Expert program that Dave Marison works with, and my department, Agricultural, Environmental and Development Economics. We put on a panel every year. We used to call it the Tobin Talk because we're in the Tobin building just down near the entrance. It's now the Talk on Friday Avenue, which is a copyrighted title, and I'm earning huge property rights royalties on that. So today we're going to talk about carbon markets. For those of you who don't know me, I'm going to chair this panel. I've got a set of questions that the panelists have seen. We may go all over the place, who knows, and I'm going to be very happy to take questions as we go along from the audience. You don't just want to hear the talking heads talking about carbon markets. So my name's Ian Sheldon. I hold the Anderson's Chair in Agricultural Marketing, Trade and Policy in the department. And on the panel, I'm really grateful for these guys accepting my invitation to come out here today. First on my left is Peggy Hall. She's a field specialist in agriculture and resource law. So she's the legal expert on the panel, and you were a practicing lawyer, maybe do still practice for many years. So she's the legal eagle on the panel. And then next on my left is Brent Songen, who's a professor in my department. Brent has written extensively about forestry and carbon sequestration. And very importantly, he's contributed to the UN International Panel on Climate Change. And if you read the Columbus Dispatch, he had an article, I think, back in early August talking about carbon markets, if I remember rightly. And then further left is Luke Crumley. Luke's here from the Ohio Corn and Wheat Growers Association. And your official title is, let me see, he's the Director of Public Policy and Nutrient Management, and he's the expert at that organization talking about carbon markets. Now, I guess
that's the loosest definition of expert I think we can use.
Well, you should take advantage of me picking you up there. And then last but not least, it's great to have Jessica Ambrosio here. She's the Ohio Agricultural Project Director from the Ohio branch of the state of Ohio's part of the Nature Conservancy. And I've interacted quite a bit with Jessica through a big sustainability project that's run by some of my colleagues out of the department. So without further ado, I've structured this a little bit, so I'm going to throw out questions. And the first question is just sort of a broad question to get us thinking about carbon markets, and what are they, and why are they getting so much attention? And I don't remember at a previous Farm Science Review, we might have talked about carbon sequestration, but I don't remember us talking about carbon markets as they related to agriculture. So who would like to have a go at answering that question? I mean, I'm happy to go down the line, but okay.
Start with Peggy.
So Peggy, and actually I'm going to go you, then I'm going to do it alternately. We'll do it like that. So Peggy.
Yes, I agree with you, Ian. Years ago, carbon markets came up in the legal world, and we kind of all went, oh, and then before we knew it, they were gone. And so now they are back, and I think there are a number of reasons for that, given where we are in environmental law and policy right now. But I think from a legal perspective, a carbon market is a market set up to exchange the value offered by a reduction in carbon emissions. And I have a lot of legal questions about that concept in and of itself that we'll discuss later. But it should be a tradable good. I think that's the intent, that farmers can create and trade. And we'll talk about the legal issues related to that. Who are you bouncing to next?
Luke.
So I'll answer the second half of your question. Why are we talking about them so much? And I do think that there's a misconception potentially within agriculture that these have kind of come out of nowhere in the wake of the most recent presidential election. And admittedly, the current administration is pushing heavily on environmental policy. But the discussions around these carbon markets actually evolved in the 2 to 3 years prior to that election occurring. These markets have been developing from a free market standpoint for a number of years. They're natural evolution, in my opinion, for cap and trade discussions that we've had long term. But it's really important for me to capture on the political side here. This isn't new and just because of the election of the Biden administration. This has been moving this way for some time now, and I believe we should have sobriety in talking about these markets because I think we can reasonably expect they will exist well beyond this current administration. So I want to get that political side out of the way.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So Brent, what are your thoughts on what are these markets and why are they suddenly on the horizon here in our sector?
Well, on the question, how long have they been around? They really been around a long time. And the first transactions for carbon occurred in 1999. In fact, actually, American Electric Power was one of the big investors in several carbon projects in different parts of the world. And they basically started this entire set of investigation of can we use land-based credits. It was pretty clear you could use carbon credits that are traded amongst big companies that emit carbon into the air. The question was, would you use land-based credits? So they sort of innovated on that. Smart innovation with the Nation Conservancy, actually. The Nation Conservancy was the organization they went to along. Well, I guess CI was involved as well. They went to these organizations to try to figure out how to do this. They've been around a long time. They've been, millions, billions of dollars of transactions so far. The market right now is around 400 million this year, and globally in terms of transactions. And it just continues to grow. Why is it doing it? In my opinion, it's because the private market is allowed to do what it does. The private sector, large companies are out there saying, we want carbon credits, they want carbon credits because they're trying to move to what they're going to call net zero. So they'd like to offset their emissions from driving cars, driving trucks, moving products around. They want to offset those emissions, and in order to do that, they need to buy up things that take carbon out of the atmosphere. It turns out that putting it in the soils and putting it in trees are ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere using something that's been around for millennia. I think even more than millennia, probably billions of years, called photosynthesis.
Thanks, Brent. Jessica, what are your thoughts on why these markets are getting so much public attention?
Yeah, from our perspective, which of course is the climate change environmental perspective, like Ben said, we've been involved in the forestry markets for quite a long time, but we understand that there's a couple different ways we need to meet our climate change. So we do it at a scale and speed that's pretty big and pretty fast. And so one big piece of that is natural climate solutions. And so that's basically using nature, using soils, using water, and helping nature help us sequester soil and reduce the emissions, and moving us towards a more decarbonized economy. And so I think that's where and why agriculture has been brought into the conversations, because agriculture relies on soil and water resources to function. And so there's a big opportunity with a lot of the soils and a lot of our land base across the country and across the world that is used for agriculture production.
One additional piece, just building off of what Brent said. The companies aren't doing this just because they want to do it. And this is really important to understand. As much as I hate to claim it, I am part of the millennial generation. And when you look at spending practices of millennials and Generation Z, the generation immediately behind millennials coming up, we're becoming the largest purchasing entity within the economy. And our buying preferences are different. We have, generally speaking, a greater interest in participating in markets that provide some kind of social benefit when we purchase a good. When you think about a company like Tom's, the shoemaker, and their initiatives to help provide goods to those in need, there's a reason why they resonate so well with millennials and Generation Z. You're seeing the same type of discussion emerge around carbon markets, largely driven by consumers. Another reason why we need to be sober, realize these aren't going away anytime soon.
Thanks, Luke. I guess as an aging grain boomer, I haven't been thinking about this problem in the way that you have. So moving on from sort of that fairly general, sort of staking out why are we hearing about these markets and broadly what are they? I want to drill down a little bit, firstly, into the economic sort of side of this. So I'm going to start with Brent as the economist on the panel, but I'm happy to allow everybody to maybe chip in once Brent's had a chance to talk about this. But so from an economic standpoint, and this is Carbon Markets 101. How do these markets work? I mean, how do they actually function as an economic concept? And you've all touched upon this, but what are the expected benefits in terms of carbon emissions if these markets actually function as they're designed to function? So, Brent, I'm throwing that one out to you.
Sure. There's the key issue is obviously what's hard as an economist to avoid talking about demanders and suppliers. But there's a demand side because millennials who are demanding this stuff, right? That Google, Amazon, everybody else is providing all of us, and they're asking those companies to be carbon neutral. So those companies are the demanders. On the supply side, then you have to have people who can supply those credits. So the landowners, farmers, people with any kind of land that can produce photosynthesis on it, then have to go out and figure out, okay, how am I going to do that? There's practices they can use, conservation tillage, if you decide to move towards permanent conservation tillage, cover crops, moving to grasslands, buffers, things like that can all sequester carbon. And so if you decide to do that, then you can get paid for that, and the carbon that you put in those practices is a marketable commodity, basically. It becomes a marketable commodity. What you have to do to get that to happen is you have to find someone who is willing to sort of make mediate the transaction between you as a landowner and the buyer, who's the big company out there who wants those things. And those could be a lot of different companies could be doing that, and that market's going to know a lot more about that. A lot more about that. There's a lot of people out there who can do that. As far as I can tell, the market's functioning actually quite well right now. There are people out there working to create more supply, working to help farmers learn more about this and landowners learn more about this. There's a big lack of information that still needs to be addressed, but we're starting to see a lot of movement in this market. And I guess the only other point on that is that you have to have some kind of verification. Just like you would verify the quality of your corn or soybean when you sell it, you have to be able to verify the commodity that carbon is in the soil or in the trees or whatever. And there are verification firms that do that. There's 6 or 7 of them now that can basically verify that. They're pretty good at doing that. They've got pretty good techniques for that. There's methodologies that are developed. A lot more methodologies will be developed over time to make sure we do this correctly. But I think those are the key aspects of it.
Thanks, Brent. Would anybody else like to jump in? Jessica.
I'd just like to follow up and kind of maybe touch on with the group this concept of offsets, carbon offsets versus insets, and the differences in the marketplace. And maybe that's a question back to our panel too, and everyone being understanding there are differences. So there's carbon offsets, which we understand to be offsetting emissions across different supply chains. So agriculture is sequestering soil carbon. That could be a credit can be generated and sold to an industry like the shipping industry versus an inset, whereas all of the carbon generated and credits generated stay within the supply chain to reduce the carbon footprint of the overall food supply chain or agriculture supply chain. And are those markets seeming different? Are they function? Do you think they're functioning the same way?
It's a loaded question, Jessica.
No, but it's important to know that there's two simultaneous things happening. And one, we have some good ideas about with the offset market from the forestry space, and one we have less good idea about in the ag space, and that's the inset market.
Yeah, and Brent touched on this in his comments. We have knowledge about all this because of the success of the forestry credits, but agricultural credits are substantially different. There's a big gap when it comes to certain aspects that we'll get into, I'm sure, in a few minutes. But these insets, those are tougher to understand, I think, for a lot of growers. How am I going to do it versus a grower from inset versus directly selling an offset? What value does that add to me as I'm selling that downstream to my customers? Honestly, we don't have a lot of great answers to that. But again, I'm going to tie this back to the consumer. Who here has ordered a burrito from Chipotle anytime in the past 6 months? Okay, few hands. If you went online and you ordered it online, Did you scroll down beneath your receipt to see what they have underneath your receipt? Right now, they are showing the number of acres that are sequestering carbon as part of that purchase, how your purchase is supporting water quality. They're building all of that in, so they're talking about these inset markets in their products already, indicating how they're sourcing their grains, their meat, their dairy is already playing into that broader carbon picture for them. It's really interesting to see this unfolding in front of us.
Maggie, did you have anything to add to that? Okay, so beyond reducing carbon emissions, which is obviously the fundamental objective of these markets, I'll throw this one to Jessica, and then maybe Luke, you can jump in from the farm sector itself. But beyond carbon emissions, what do you think the other environmental benefits might? What are the additional benefits that might be garnered from these markets growing and functioning the way that Brent and you guys have been describing?
That's a good question, and that's a big part of the reason why the Nature Conservancy and other environmental groups are involved in the ag and urban market sector, and what we might expand to say the ecosystem service market opportunities that might be available. And kind of as I mentioned a few minutes ago, their soil sequestration, soil carbon also has a lot of benefits. So when you do practices that are beneficial for healthy soils, minimizing disturbance of the soils, having a living root there, taking care of your soils, taking care of your crops, those also have multiple benefits, and those have multiple benefits for water quality, helps keep nutrients in the soil, helps keep those that soil from eroding and washing downstream, so that keeps our waterways clean and healthy. We also have, when we take a look at practices on the farm field that are good for soil health and for crop production, they also have good benefits for biodiversity as well. So those are some of the multiple, beyond carbon, just sequestering carbon or reducing nitrous oxide emissions. A lot of these same practices and a lot of these conservation practices that we try to encourage growers to do have multiple benefits.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and if I can beg everyone's forgiveness to go into the Wayback Machine period, I want to go back to January of this year, and I want to thank Brent and Jessica for hopping onto an idea that we had at Ohio Corn back in January, after basically a year of talking about exactly what Jessica was discussing just now, the natural overlap between our water quality efforts in the state and the opportunity to bring private sector dollars to the same practices in these carbon markets. We decided we didn't know enough about what was going on. So our Growers Association spearheaded something we're calling a strike team. I was pleased to lead that alongside one of our growers. And that strike team brought in folks like TNC, Ohio State, Farm Bureau, both of our main national organizations, NOG and National Corn Growers Association. And we started wrapping our head around this collaboratively to see what these overlaps were, because that's what really started the discussion. Trying to find a way to guarantee that the good practices we need on the ground to promote water quality up in the Western Lake Erie Basin had a longer horizon, let's say that. And that we had an opportunity to bring in additional dollars, because we can't guarantee state funding for programs like that in the long term. But as we've talked about this, I've realized that there are other benefits that no one's really talking about yet that are more grower specific. And I want to focus in on the data real quick. Right now, there is this tug and pull between agricultural producers and suppliers, and how we track and manage data, how we protect grower data for their operations, how you maintain ownership of that. And that is really critical. And these carbon markets are kind of forcing the conversation along a little bit faster on that data front. And I do think that because of that drive in these markets, you're going to see a secondary benefit for our growers, where we're going to start talking about things like blockchain technology and how we can track practices on the field anonymously for a grower, but trace your corn all the way to the end user so that they can track their carbon footprint without your data coming into the public domain. So there are these other benefits out there that I think we're going to start talking about in the next couple of years. It's just not quite right yet. Right now, we have the immediate benefit of a lot of quality fight, but long term, there's some real opportunities here for growers as well.
It's a really interesting follow-up. I hadn't thought about the connection to blockchain technology. I mean, I think with the pandemic, it's made us think a lot about blockchain technology and value chains and how they function or how they don't function. And that's a really interesting connection that you made.
You and everyone else is going to get sick of me talking about the consumer. At Ohio Corner Wheat, one of our primary missions is to open up new markets. And when we look at markets like Europe, that we have a disadvantage right now in getting American grain into Europe, partly because of the sustainability story that we're not yet telling well enough. And when we think about traceability through things like blockchain and connecting it to those practices, we're going to be able to stand with the rest of the world and really probably set the standard for the rest of the world, if I'm being honest, on sustainably produced goods and open up markets that are going to be really important for us in the future, like Europe.
As somebody who follows the Brexit debate, there's a lot of concern in the UK about signing a free trade agreement with the US, and one of the big concerns is food safety and other food production standards. So I think it's kind of interesting that you're talking about matching yourselves up with a different kind of consumer, not a different kind of consumer, but maybe more aggressive consumer, going back to your conversation about Gen X and millennials. So we talked about broad, we talked about economic benefits. I want to bring Peggy into the conversation, so I'm going to jump ahead in my questions here. Peggy, as these markets evolve, and I know you've been thinking about this and writing about this, what are the key legal issues for farmers that want to enter an offset contract?
Well, it's interesting you would ask about the contract first, because that's usually what we focus on, but I have some issues before the contract.
Carry on.
Could I address those first? Before we even get to the contract, I think we need to give some careful consideration to the type of property right that we're creating in the carbon market. And there's a lot of gray in that consideration. Some states have started to move toward trying to clarify what the property right is. But basically, we're trying to decide, is this a property right in real property? Is it a real property interest? Or is it an intangible personal property right that we've created? And that's a very important legal question, because how we continue to track and allow transfers and even enforce that legal interest is going to depend upon how we consider it, whether it's real property or personal property. I mentioned some states, California, for instance, has already passed legislation that says this cannot be considered a real property interest. But many states are far behind, and we don't have anything in Ohio that helps us determine that type of legal interest. So I think that feeds into the agreement, the carbon agreement question. Even if you agree to this, what exactly have you created, and how enforceable is that into the future? And how transferable is it? And those questions are going to be answered depending upon how we define that right. So that's the first.
So can I just jump in then? So it's not surprising that California's sort of ahead of this, just based on the fact that they had a functioning carbon market now for some time. Contracts are being priced off their permit trading system out in California. Is there anything on the horizon here at the state level or amongst the legal profession generally to think about that issue?
I think actually the tendency in the legal profession is to define this as a property interest in real property. And that's because it would be easier to document and enforce into the future. So we could record that property interest and give notice of its existence. And as I said, enforce it into the future. There are a lot of issues that arise with it simply being an intangible personal property right. So now we're looking at something on paper that we expect to have permanence, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Yet how do we enforce that permanence if it's an intangible personal property right? Those two conflict with one another. So in the legal profession, I think we are leaning more toward real property. I don't know, Luke would probably know whether Ohio is discussing anything. I haven't heard anything at this this point. Federally, we were hoping something would come in the Growing Climate Change Act, Solutions Act, but it did not.
I can't see a pathway for the federal government to make that kind of determination. It would have to be state by state. And honestly, that's really important for our growers to understand. Our system of federalism is really on their side right now, because when I hear a preference for real property versus intangible property, there's some questions there that are important to growers. Most importantly, who's going to get paid in each of those scenarios? And I don't know if you wanted to share that a little bit more, but at the state level, I don't see any debates happening right now that would make that determination in Ohio, but it's something we definitely need to look into.
I think it's a concern that will create a lot of litigation in the future if we don't address it now.
So let's just assume the property rights issue is not a problem. Somebody advising somebody in the audience who's thinking about entering into an offset contract.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the basic legal issues? And I guess I've been reading a little bit about what a quote high quality offset contract might look like. What are the critical dimensions that both as a lawyer you would want farmers to consider? So I'll let you answer that. It's a long question, and I know it's a complex one.
And it has a long answer, unfortunately. But I can highlight some of the primary issues. One is this concept of permanence that we should discuss more. But how long does that credit, does that sequestration, does that reduction have to be in place? Many of the contracts have some vague language suggesting that it must remain. And if there's a change in that, then we've lost that contractual right to be paid for that. So permanence is a concern we need to examine further. And I think, again, it goes hand in hand with defining the type of property right. We can't have good answers on permanence until we know what type of property right it is legally. Another one is verification. How do we, what are the parameters within that agreement on how we will verify whether you actually created that contract? We see some differences in how the different companies are handling that issue as far as verifying. And the federal act that I just mentioned would create a third-party verification system that could help with that. That is one role the federal government, I think, can play. I agree with Luke that much of this is going to be based on state law. So verification is a provision to closely examine in the agreement. And I've seen differences from what they say is in the agreement. We have a hard time finding any of these agreements and being able to review them unless we are actually interested in contracting ourselves. So verification, and then another one would be that data confidentiality issue. As Luke already mentioned, data is very, very much involved in verifying, documenting, baseline, whether the credit was created, but what's happening to that data, who has rights to that data, how is it being used? That would be another provision that I would have concerns about. And then there's this concept of additionality too that we should discuss, because many of the programs want you as the producer to say, you have to create a new credit from your practices. It can't be something that pre-existed your agreement. And that, as you can imagine, becomes pretty difficult to sort out and untangle. At what point did this carbon credit arise, and from what practices? And who owns it at that point? And who is paying? Are they really paying for something that was generated by the actions that they're paying to do? So additionality, I think, is another legal issue that could get some producers into trouble.
So if additionality is going to be a key part of many of these are private markets. The design of the contract is not necessarily in the hands of an individual farmer or lawyer, for that matter. Is additionality, do you think, going to be a major disincentive to farmers getting involved, at least initially, in carbon markets? And just to highlight the fact that Peggy's talking about additionality the way that it's largely discussed in the media. I know Brent has a slightly different perspective. So Peggy, if you want to, or anybody else want to quickly answer the way Peggy's discussed additionality, then I'm going to bring Brent in. Peggy? This guy said no.
You're on the hot seat.
So well, let's bring Brent in first.
Right in,
I'll-
because I think this
I'm
is
still sitting here. I never left. Going.
I'll
Nice talking to them. Well, I guess the main way I look at the additionality question, which I think David correctly described, is not so much an additionality question as what are we going to give the rest of the world for free? So right now, anyone who owns a piece of forest land, and that includes a lot of farmers who have a lot of forest land, are giving the federal government and taxpayers in the U.S. a $20 billion per year asset for free. So it's a taking. I don't know why lawyers don't talk about that. It's an asset taking. I mean, the way the U.S. government uses that is when they go out and negotiate an international treaty called the Paris Agreement. They incorporate the 800 million tons of carbon dioxide that our forests and farmlands currently sequester in the U.S. into that deal, and then they say, you know what, we're going to reduce our emissions by X, and we're not going to make the rest of the energy sector, which we should make, reduce their emissions. We're not going to make them reduce it by this much because the forestry and farmland sector are already doing that for free for us. That's the additional stuff you're worried about. It's not what it is a taking. It's not an additionality issue. So this comes to the difference between the way lawyers and economists think of property rights. So economists think of property rights and say, well, the additionality question really is just simply a property rights. How do I actually characterize the conversation around additionality? And in my opinion, I love you guys, but the farm sector has done, the people who sort of operate in terms of governance with the farm sector have done a poor job sort of characterizing this issue. I'm trying to say this. It really needs to be talked about in the right sort of way because it's actually taking us from this sector. And they're using it, the government's using it. It's fine for them to use it, but they're just using it for free. And potentially people could become. So, you got me fired up now. So this is how actually, in my view, if the Growing Climate Solutions Act, I think it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible act. It's the worst act written in the history of humanity as far as I'm concerned. I sound like somebody we know out there. Okay, so the issue with it is that it tries to do something that independent and private verification agencies have done really, really well. What it doesn't do is it doesn't take care of this additionality problem, right? So the way the government can handle the additionality problem is to compensate managers. And this is the thing they should compensate managers, right? This is actually why, because it's an impossible issue for the private sector to solve alone, the government actually can compensate landowners for what they're providing. The federal government, when it negotiates with other countries for free, they can compensate for that. So this is how, in my opinion, the Growing Climate Solutions Act should be written, is to compensate landowners for the carbon that they're already producing. And then you can start to negotiate over the extra stuff, the new stuff that farmers can do to increase the carbon, which is actually enormous, right? It's another 30% of the emission reduction we need to make in the U.S. So I'm not done yet. This is great. The permanence issue, I don't think we have to disagree on additionality at all.
Well, one question I would ask though is, I think when you look at forestry, that's one thing. When you look over at agricultural production, crops, we already have so many government programs that are paying many landowners or tenant operators to engage in those actions and practices. And so I think you have to untangle that from the takings issue that you raise. Is that fair? I see a difference between timber and crops.
So you're arguing that we've already compensated farmers.
In some cases, but surely not in all.
I think that's a legitimate discussion. I think that's a legitimate discussion. Now, on the permanence thing, I'll just say this, that from the perspective of the atmosphere, you can define a trade-off between 1 ton stored for 1 year. Well, I'll give you the number. It's 1 ton stored for 1 year on your farm is actually you would have to store 30 tons for 1 year on your farm in order to offset 1 ton emitted per million to the atmosphere. It's just that simple, right? So there's a simple thing. We don't have to worry about permanence. We don't have to worry about storing it there for decades or centuries or anything like that. We just have to say, well, I'm going to store 30 tons for 1 year, and you, Amazon, can offset 1 ton. That's simple. And it works with the atmosphere. It's not a complicated, actually, it is a lot of complicated math, but it actually boils down to a really simple set of numbers. So permanence is a big issue, I agree, 100%, but it's a simple solution to it. And it's just, I'm dumbfounded that we haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah, so I would ask with that. Can I ask with that?
Absolutely. This is what's great for a panel chair. You can let these guys take over.
I thought I was going to luck out and stay out of that one.
Why are we seeing companies so focused on the concept of permanence if it's as simple as permanence?
Before I answer that, because I need to think about it, I'm just going to thank the official sponsor of Brent Songen today, Weeze. It is very clear that you ate your Weeze.
A lot of coffee.
There are differing approaches on permanence right now, and there are different markets evolving. And Jessica might actually have some really key insights on this. Depending on who's approached you so far as a grower, you may have been approached by Indigo Ad, you may have been approached by Nutrien, you may have been approached by Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, which is a completely nonprofit entity. And all of them have different approaches to their contracts because they are viewing permanence a little bit differently from organization to organization, depending on what their end goal is. So, we talk about permanence in this broad, it's the same problem for every grower. It's not. Depending on what's available for you in your area, there's a different opportunity and a different challenge. So I would challenge that. But I'm here to, fight for the grower's interest, right? To go back to Ian's initial questions about what can we do to help folks understand these better and what resources are out there and what are some of the barriers. We've acknowledged all of these barriers from the get-go. Our growers pointed out permanence is a really tough issue because as a grower, if agronomically in a given year you have to till your field to stay in production, you need to have that opportunity. It needs to be a voluntary action and built into that contract. But the moment you till, you erode the opportunity for permanence. So there's this battle happening between the companies that are offering to purchase the credits and the growers who can actually do the practices. And that's what's really going to drive down the value of these credits. Until you can establish a certain level of permanence, you're not going to see $100 per acre for the practices on your field. You're not. Because the company is not going to be able to do it. At the same time, a company should not be expecting that a $15 per acre payment is going to be good enough to get loads and loads of growers engaged. There are competing programs out there that pay better. Case in point, H2 Ohio, which if you are working really diligently with an H2 Ohio up in the Western Lake Erie Basin, and you qualify for that, you can actually approach that $100 per acre mark. I'm not going to, if I was a grower, I wouldn't want to go for $15 an acre when I didn't have a better program, right? So you've got this battle happening.
Jessica, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the fray of permanence and additionality. It is their problem, and it creates risk, right? And that's where all the risk comes, and that's where the uncertainty comes. And I think some of the challenges we have overall, especially when we compare the carbon market in agriculture to the carbon market in forestry, we basically know how a tree behaves in multiple different trees. They grow for a long time, they stick around for a while, they're going to be around. And so the permanence issue is pretty straightforward. Trees are around for 100 years, we know they're going to be there, and the only time we know that carbon picture changes is when the forest burns or when we cut it down, right? That's pretty obvious. Whereas in agriculture, it's so dynamic, and every field's a little different, and every area of the country does a slightly different operation. And it changes basically annually. And so it's really that high flux and that high variability creates a lot of uncertainty in these markets. And a lot of uncertainty with the contracts and how to establish the contracts and the parameters of the contracts. And so until we can kind of get our minds wrapped around that or have some baseline databases to go by in agriculture, we don't have baseline databases for carbon and carbon soil sequestration set yet. We don't have whether that's going to be a federal government decision or an industry decision together. There's going to be a lot of risk and uncertainty over the next couple of years as we find out. One of the things that makes the economics a little tenuous too is that verification aspect. So do do we know that we're actually sequestering carbon, and is that carbon really a carbon, whether we sequester it in Ohio and sell it to Oregon, or vice versa? So that's some of the questions that we're just trying to figure out. And if we have to verify it, we've got to model that, we've got to measure it, and those things are expensive. So right now it's more expensive to verify and measure that if you have carbon than it is to pay the carbon credit.
And for the growers here, if your head is spinning from the complexity of all of this, welcome to the last year and a half of all of our conversations together. These issues have, it seems like every time that we've gotten together and tried to take some kind of action forward, we've actually pulled on threads that revealed even more complexity in this. So as a growers association, we sat back and said, okay, stop everything else. What are the most immediate questions that we need to answer for growers? And we realized through the work of our strike team and the input of Brent and Jessica and others along the way that we could provide two things up front. Number one, a glossary of terms to help our growers understand these concepts like additionality, permanence. Not necessarily to engage in a debate with Peggy and Brett, but to have a baseline understanding of what are the words you're going to run into along the way as you're looking at these contracts and considering whether or not you can participate. So we have a glossary of terms on our website. We also created a list of about 16 questions for growers, really targeted toward growers. For those who are being approached by these markets, we want you to know a baseline set of questions that you can ask the person approaching you at your operation to really start digging into and revealing some of the concerns that Peggy pulled out and that Brent has highlighted here. And I would, shameless plug, ohiocornandwheat.org/carbon. Again, ohiocornandwheat.org/carbon. You can find that glossary of terms, and you can find that list of questions that, as a grower, you may need to digest a little bit before you're ready to engage in these meaty contract discussions.
Thanks, Luke, for taking care of my list of question number 9, which was you have a website, what kind of questions you're getting, and the Soybean Association also has a website too. So the industry itself is clearly grappling with how to discuss these issues in a way that people coming to their sites can understand. So I want to come back to public policy in a minute because Brent kind of lit a fuse, and I'm going to just chuck the hand grenade back there in a minute. And Peggy, feel free to jump in too. And I'm just going to run down to get myself a Bahama Mama because I know Dave Marison likes to recommend those for everybody. So before I chuck the hand grenade, is there anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question of anybody on the panel? Or we completely, we're just a bunch of pointy heads that just blinded everybody with science. So is any, yes, Kim.
I just want to give it.
Kim, could you just say who you are so people in the audience know who you are?
Yes, Kim Winslow. So I also work with these lovely people as part of the knowledge exchange. I wanted to put a shameless plug actually for Peggy's blog. She does a fantastic job updating folks on what she learns, contracts, legalese, all that. So that's part of the farm office. Farmoffice.org. Yeah.
And I have written a number of articles on carbon agreements and have a set of publications I'm doing with the National Agricultural Law Center that will hopefully be out soon that will go even into more detail, excruciating detail.
I plan to read it. As a student of the law, I have to read these things. My boss has a question, and did you have your hand up?
No,
And
I
then
just enjoy it.
I'm trying to ignore my former colleague Alan Lyons, but I'm going to let him ask a question after Tim. So that's a cheap shot at my former colleague. Tim first, and then Alan Lyons. So Tim's the department chair.
Peggy, I'm curious on some of the legal issues. You started to touch on some of the interstate issues with finding property rights and the sort of cap and trade issues. I'm thinking of programs like the outside trading program that was successful for a while, but then ran into legal issues with some of the industry commerce. Do you see that as an issue, ignoring international issues of leakage and other things? Do you see that as an issue
Yes, I think that is an additional issue we could consider with the market itself and that trading and the interstate commerce issue and how the different states could have conflicting interpretations of that good that we're trading. And again, I know Luke didn't want the Growing Climate Solutions Act to get into some of the states' rights, but I think that is the role that the federal government could play, is try to provide at least some guidance on how, when we start trading these nationally, as we will, how we can consistently interpret the value and legal interest that's created there.
Not that I don't want the act. I don't think it's the worst act ever written. I'll be honest. It is very limited in scope, and I'm going to speak as a lobbyist here and try to find good and bad on both sides.
Yeah.
It's very limited. It does not go far enough to fully protect growers, but that's, again, not necessarily the role that the federal government should be playing in this. And we have to find that proper balance. There are existing laws that could come into play, and you'd be much better to talk on this about interstate commerce and the natural overlap there. But Congress has an opportunity right now to help remove some of the fog around this topic. And the way they can do that is helping create a known list of quality verifiers who can help growers understand their capacity to sequester carbon. That's like the bare minimum. Much to Brent's point, that's the bare minimum. That's why it's not an all-encompassing piece of legislation, and frankly, it's not going anywhere. It passed in the Senate, kind of, but it still has to go through the House in a really divided time going into the 2022 midterm elections. No way in the... Sorry, I'm not going to curse. It's not going anywhere.
I just offer counter to the Generation Z, the millennials, and people like that out there who are really into climate change and are worried about the earth ending. Let me just point out that the estimate of the finance that's needed for meeting a 1.5 to 2 degree temperature target, which is, it's just what people think about, right? But if we're going to meet that, we need $200 million per year in finance to go into the agriculture and forestry sector. And there's no way any government's going to put that kind of money up. The only way that will happen is through the private sector. The problem is when the federal government decides to create a list of verifiers and people like that, then they get in, they box it up. This Permanence is the perfect example of that. And that's actually, I'll lay that claim at not the feet of the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Foundation, Wildlife Conservation Society, a bunch of other ones, who argued for these crazy permanence rules that require a contract, a person who has the agricultural land or the forest land to hold that land exactly as it is for 100 years. That's the dumbest thing in the world. Nobody is going to do that. So what they did is they reduced supply. So if you want to get $200 billion worth of finance out there, you have to figure out a way to make the market work and have it function effectively. The government is terrible at that. It's absolutely horrible at that. All right, it will destroy that market quicker than you can imagine. So I really argue strenuously to keep the government out because we will never solve this climate problem if the government gets involved. Because the permanence is a great example because we define set rules. California defined the permanence rules, and it's why we're stuck with this stupid idea that doesn't need to exist. And the reason why it doesn't need to exist is the climate science, actually. It says it doesn't need to exist, but they work.
So I guess I didn't need to throw the hand grenade.
Absolutely right.
Absolutely right. Jessica and Peggy, you want to jump in here? No, you don't want to get caught in the
role here is for the private markets because we can't move at the speed of government on this issue. Okay, if we're going to debate this for the next 50 years, the problem has already occurred. I think we have some agreement there, but $200 billion is a reasonable estimate, but right now we're even ignoring the low hanging. There's a real opportunity right now if we step away from the carbon markets and the exchanges for a second. When you look at grain production in America and our downtrace customers, think about biofuels and ethanol in particular. Right now, ethanol, under its current life cycle analysis, with what the growers in this room are already doing, what they're already doing has ethanol reducing GHG emissions by 46% compared to the gasoline it's blended with today. If we make a $25 billion investment in ethanol plants across the country and help them install carbon capture equipment and sequester equipment that allows them to pump the carbon from their stacks directly into the earth and store it away permanently. That takes the carbon score from that 46% for ethanol to 70% overnight. And we have now positioned a long-term market for grain producers that's much more valuable, in my opinion, than the current carbon markets.
Jessica, did you want to jump in here?
I don't have a direct comment to what you just said, but I think it's going to require a lot of multiple solutions like that. So it's not just going to be growing different types of crops. It's not just going to be land conversion. It's not just going to be soil health. It's got to be technology. It's got to be decarbonizing. It's got to be reducing emissions. It's got to be looking at a variety of fuel sources and renewable energy sources. It's got to be a variety of solutions to get to the scale we need to get to. I do think that the private sector does need to put up some money if we don't want the government involved, but we're not seeing that happen quite yet. We're seeing a lot of promises. We're seeing a lot of net zero claims by 2030, 2025. We're not seeing the massive investment yet. We're seeing a lot of pilot scale, pilot level, couple thousand acres, 30,000 acres at a time level. That's great to test these things out, but it's not going to get us at where we should be.
You kind of indirectly asked another one of my questions, which was that if we look at the food chains and pretty well-known companies, Walmart being the best example, which, as you just said, are making claims about, well, they're arguing they're going to have zero emissions by whatever date. Are companies like Walmart even anywhere near the market yet? Or is it all, they're talking the talk and they're not walking the walk on this?
Well, I'm just going to point out that I will give Walmart and McDonald's and a bunch of other companies a pass because they've already scaled up a multi-million acre project in the Amazon. So in 2004, when 2 million acres per year, hectares per year, versus 5 million acres per year were being deforested, Walmart, Amazon, Walmart, McDonald's, and a whole bunch of other companies which were basically purchasing soybeans and cattle from the Amazon, got together and put in place a soybean moratorium and a cattle moratorium, reduced deforestation from 2 million hectares per year down to less than 400,000 hectares per year by 2014. They've already scaled up a massive program to reduce emissions. That's 600 million tons of carbon dioxide per year between 2004 and 2014, which was eliminated from the atmosphere. It didn't go into the atmosphere because of what Walmart, Amazon, why did I keep saying Amazon? They didn't have anything to do with it except what the Amazon is what we saved, right? So, I mean, I'll give them a pass. I think they can actually scale something up if they want to. Microsoft, Amazon, the Amazon company, Apple, they are putting a lot of money into this, and there's a lot of contracts that they put in place right now. I mean, I sat there with the fellow from Natural Climate NCX, and he said basically, I can't go a day without somebody calling me up and offering me $200 million to go out and do these contracts. So I mean, it's real money.
And the deforestry and the global marketplace and Amazon, I agree. And I think it's a mixed bag right now with the companies, and that's where we're concerned. We want to make sure that it's not just greenwashing, and it really is. They're not just talking the talk without walking the walk. And some companies really are, like Brent mentioned, and there's quite a few more out there, and some aren't quite yet.
And I think that takes us back to the verification issue. Is having certainty that what Walmart says and what's happening down in Amazon is truly creating this credit, this good, this impact, whatever we want to call it. And that's, again, the role of the federal government in that verification and oversight. Are you confident that they are doing what they're doing with Grant and that we can quantify what they've done? You're confident in that methodology and verification?
On the avoided deforestation, yes, because it's easy to watch.
That one's
just because satellite imagery is pretty good. Any afforestation is the same thing. Soil carbon is slightly different, but we don't have to have it there for everything. So it's all for this question.
But this is really what we see in any emerging market. This is the creative disruption of capitalism. We're asking a lot of questions today because we're generating a lot of questions. And the reason why I haven't lost hope in any of this, and the reason why I do think eventually those companies can get to those goals, is that I'm not willing to discount American farmers and American innovation. I'm not willing to say that our growers aren't going to get better. Every time they invest in new equipment, every time they try and practice on their fields, they're moving along that chain, that spectrum, and that's going to feed into those broader goals. And we have, a real opportunity to be a world leader on this. And I think that's where the national political debate has fallen short in my view, is that we're not talking about this as an opportunity. We're only talking about the challenges. And we have an opportunity to make good money while also saving the planet.
Well, we're close to the end of our time. I think I'm getting a signal from these guys over here. We want to set up for the Ask the Expert program. But I had questions still about, I decided that we already trashed the Growing Climate Solutions Act. So, which is pretty small potatoes in terms of the amount of money that the Senate bill was going to put into it. And I was going to ask about the possibility of the CCC being asked, this discussion about a carbon bank. But I guess we'll leave that for another day. My guess is Brent's head would have exploded if we'd gone down that track. And I was also going to ask a question about, and this is just for some people in the audience to think about, if we put a lot of land into these carbon markets, we have a lot of forests being sequestered put into these systems to sequester carbon. Oxfam recently produced a report that was discussing, countries want to reach these zero targets in a fairly short period of time. And they're starting to express concern about if you take this much land out of production, there's a potential that you generate food security issues and food price rises. So I think we also have to think about not just the positive benefits of carbon markets, but also potentially, you're dealing with a market failure, but you're potentially generating unintended consequences. So I'm going to have to finish the panel at this point, and because we have others coming in here to answer questions. But I wanted to thank everybody very much for accepting my invitation to talk today. It's great to have panelists. I got a set of questions. I've got so many more questions I could ask. I really appreciate the fact that you guys ran with it, and we're incredibly knowledgeable about this, and I'm sure they'd be happy to hang around and visit. I see my friends from the media here. I think I see somebody else from the media down here, so I'm sure you'd be happy to do some interviews with these guys if they've got questions for you. So without any further ado, thanks to Peggy, Brent, Luke, and Jessica so much for coming out here today.